Did you know that African Americans account for over 30% of all drug convictions, despite the fact that they only account for 12.5% of all drug users? The war on drugs was created in 1971 by Richard Nixon in his response to what he called Public Enemy Number One. I'm here today to convince you that the war on drugs was a false and failed effort. And on top of that, it was used to criminalize the Black communities of the time and has continued to have repercussions to this day. I'm going to do that with three main points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how since the war on drugs has begun, drug consumption has only increased. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how African Americans have been targeted and convicted at alarmingly disproportionate rates. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking about how this war has destroyed the social, economic, and community infrastructures that have been targeted. Since the war on drugs began, the cost of heroin, cocaine, and cannabis have all fell significantly, with the cost of heroin falling 81%, cocaine falling 80%, and cannabis falling 86%. Purity for heroin has risen 60%, purity for cocaine has risen 11%, and the purity for cannabis has risen at an alarming 161%. If you look to a graph on the left, this will show you that the red indicates the purity of the substance and the blue indicates the cost. What all this information essentially tells us is that these drugs have not only become more readily available, but they've also become stronger. This is a clear indication that the war on drugs have been failing. Next, I'm going to be talking about the efficiency, incarceration, and costs. Since the war began, the US costs have exceeded over $1 trillion, while drug users have been averaging $100 billion a year. We've seen no comparable decrease in crime or drug use, while we've seen 5 times the number of incarcerations. If you look to the left, you'll see a graph with the spike in incarcerations from 1984 till 2013. This can be directly attributed to the war on drugs. Next, I'll be talking about the racial and legal disparities present in the war on drugs. Whites use and sell drugs at similar rates to their Black and Latin counterparts. However, minorities constitute for over 57% of all drug offenses. Black drug offenders are given significantly more jail time than their white counterparts and are also 13 times more likely to receive jail time for drug offenses. This graph shows an increase in Black male drug convictions from 1983 to 1999. You can see a spike from 1987 until 1991. This all can be attributed to the war on drugs. The long-term impacts. Long-term impacts of the war on drugs, due to the fact that it has targeted only specific communities, have been incredibly devastating. This war began the start of a pattern of mass Black incarceration. This pattern has continued to this day, and we can directly attribute Black poverty to the war on drugs. If you look to the left below, you'll see the average rate of incarceration by race and ethnicity. You'll be alarmed to see that Blacks are jailed at almost 3 times the rate than their white counterparts. The data here was collected from 1978 to 2014. Chain reaction. Mass incarceration has had a chain reaction on the Black community, Black children, and Black families. 70% of Black adolescents raised in concentrated poverty remain there. 55% of Blacks raised in small poverty end up in higher poverty, while concentrated white adolescent poverty is almost non-existent, says Harvard professor. Only 9% of whites raised in low poverty end up in high poverty. If you look to the left, we can see that from 1974 to 2014, Blacks have been at 3 times the poverty rate as their white counterparts. All the data I've shown you today, the graphs, have been from 1974 to 2014, or in that range. This is for a reason. This is the range of the war on drugs that is still continued to this day, and these are the effects that are still happening to this day. This effort has failed, and on top of that, it's criminalized people and taken away so much from them. Statistical impacts. Blacks, due to their mass incarceration, are 2 times as more likely than their white counterparts to be unemployed. When you go to jail, when you get out of jail and apply for a job, you have to go through a background check. This is a direct reason why Blacks have a hard time finding a job, because they have been targeted and mass incarcerated. Over 54% of Black children grow up in single-parent households. Many of these households are without their males. Blacks are also 30% less likely than their white counterparts to own homes. And if you look to the left, we see another graph from 1975 to 2010, with unemployment rates also showing Hispanic and Latins. Today, we're just going to focus on the green and the red. The red represents the whites, and the green represents the blacks. As you can see, from 1975 to 2010, blacks have steadily been unemployed at 2 times the rate as their white counterparts. This is no coincidence, considering that this is the era of the war on drugs. In review, the war on drugs failed at its so-called objective to decrease drug consumption and use in the United States. This war was used to target Black communities nationwide, and it has rippling effects on the communities. One of these effects has been over 40 years of Black mass incarceration that has continued to this day. This has destroyed Black communities, children, and families. Thank you.